Hey guys, I just finished grading the needs assessment assignments. Overall, great job. I wanted to give a couple of general comments that hopefully will be transferable to any future writing you do. And these are suggestions, these are things that I do when I'm writing a paper. So when I'm writing, especially a quantitative paper, it's very formulaic and it helps me make sure that I get all the elements in a really easy way. And so I'm going to use this paper that I did a few years ago as an example, and I'm going to go down to the methods section. So typically the methods section has three subsections. So there's usually a study design section, a measures section, and then there's usually a data analysis section. And then within those sections, there's a typical format that I use, right? So within the study design, it's exactly that. So it's telling folks this is how the data were collected. This is typically where I will also talk about if incentives were offered, IRB approval, those sort of things, right? So just kind of describing the study design and who the people are. Sometimes if I have a parent study, I'll put the parent study section, description of the parent study right up here. So for example, with Project Homes, sometimes we'll have a Project Homes overview, and then we go into the design, but often, sometimes it's combined too. Typical survey design or study design is your first. Then comes your measures. Within your measures, I typically structure my measures as the primary outcome followed by the uh, primary explanatory variables and then any other covariates. And within each of your variable descriptions, typically what I like to do is to say, this is how the variable was collected. If there is a citation that goes with it, I'll give the citation. And then I always want to say how it was entered into the model. And this is the part where some people got confused on their papers. Some people would put how the variables were entered to the model into their analysis section. I typically put it up with the variable description. So for example, with sexual violence, you can see I wrote a dichotomous sexual violence variable was created to count the number of participants reporting either IPV or sexual assault. Right, so that's typically where I'm going to put how each variable was described. Then when you get to your data analysis section, and you can see my covariates are here, for example, and I will kind of dump those together in a way where I just say like, this one was continuous, I often do continuous, and these others were done categorical. And you can see, for example, here, there's an example of the citation. I did the audit C, so I gave that as a citation. So that's kind of how I set up my measure section. And then the data analysis for me is usually a pretty brief section. That's where I just say, these are the analysis that I ran, right? In a really quick way. So you can see, I just said here, the examine the difference between categorical variables. We use students T, chi-squared, and Fisher's exact. Variables at point one were then entered into a regression model. So that's kind of typically what I do for my method section. So again, big picture, study design, measures, and then analysis. And then my results, typically I have one paragraph for each table. And the tables, there's a little bit of a stylistic preference here. So some authors prefer to create table one just as a participant characteristics table. And if they were to do that, that might look like something right here. If you just were to take this column to the left and the overall column, that's what it might look like. One of the things you'll notice with me when I do my papers is I try to structure the variable list the same way that they are structured in the measure section above. And so you'll see some parallel structure there. So you can see like under covariates, that's why I have age, gender, etc. down here after my explanatory variables at the top. That's a preference thing. Sometimes I flip that, but usually this is what I try to do. Oftentimes what I'll do is I'll combine what is a typical table one and table two for some authors. Some authors will go table one where they just have the demographics and then their table two is their bivariates. I tend to combine the two just because I like to see the overall next to the bivariate. So this is a style thing that I just thought I'd share with you. So you can see my outcomes are across the top. Here's my explanatory, here's my covariates, and there's all the bivariate analyses. And then my table two which for some folks can be a table of three, tends to be my regression results, right? So in this case, I had some logistic regression, and so I had adjusted odds ratios. And then when you're writing it up, typically when I do the write-up, I'm going to have a paragraph for each table, right? And so since I combine table one with the demographics overall as well as the bivariates, you can see here my first two paragraphs were actually table one. One described the sample, one was bivariate, and then my table two got into the regression models. So just some tips for how to write it up. Again, it's stylistic, but I wanted to give you that in case you found it helpful. All right, guys, have a great weekend, and I'll see you Monday.